Chapter 18 is looking at the second big wave of reforms in American history. It happens at the turn of the 20th century, and it's just kind of collectively called the Progressive Era. Although progressives are really a grouping of a lot of different reform movements that can sometimes be contradictory, but in general, we can kind of characterize them by a few things. So before getting into this, worth noting, I think, that you'll probably notice some similarities to the reform movements of the antebellum period. So some things like the progressive era reforms are typically led by the middle class and are typically led by women, just as the antebellum reforms had been before the Civil War. The big differentiation, though, the big difference between the antebellum reforms and the progressive reforms is that while the antebellum reforms wanted people to choose to be better, to choose to perfect themselves, the progressive movement is more about social control. It's more about rather than letting people make the choice to be better, they want the government to force people to make these decisions to be better. So I think a good contrast to put that into perspective would be in the antebellum period, some reformers wanted people to drink less, and so they pursue the temperance movement, which wants people to choose to drink less alcohol. On the other hand, like-minded reformers in the progressive era that want people to drink less alcohol don't want people to make that choice. Instead, they are pushing for prohibition, which will end up being a constitutional amendment that prohibits the sale, manufacture, and transportation of alcohol, effectively making it illegal to drink alcohol. So they don't want people, they're not going to let people choose. They know what's good for you. They're going to impose this on you through state or, in other words, government action. Um, anyway, before uh, before getting into this, one last thing to understand is that many progressive era reforms are targeting the perceived government corruption and economic problems that have been characteristic of the Gilded Age. So if you think of our rapid industrial expansion at the end of the 1800s, all the problems it creates for workers and income inequality, the problems of political party machines and politicians being in the pockets of big business. All of these kinds of things are typical targets of progressive reformers because America has changed pretty rapidly with this industrial expansion, and now society is effectively catching up to try to address the problems that this expansion has caused. So our first question, why was the city such a central element in progressive America? So the economic growth of the Gilded Age or late 1800s had continued, and that meant the continued growth of cities. And that means that we're going to continue to see stark urban inequalities. So you might have rundown tenement buildings in a slum only blocks away in, say, New York from the mansions of Fifth Avenue. So it was simply easier for people to see income inequality than it necessarily is today. Helping to expose that inequality and the different problems produced by the industrial age are journalists called muckrakers. Muckrakers were writers or journalists who used journalism, basic investigative reporting techniques, to expose the ugly underside of American life. Things like political corruption or bad business practices or the plight of the American working class. They are doing this to expose these problems to a wider audience, and in doing so, make general calls for reform. They typically don't offer solutions. Instead, they're trying to bring these problems to light, sort of raking things up, hence muckraker, so that it can be addressed by the public. A few good examples to know. One is Ida Tarbell's History of the Standard Oil Company, which helps to expose some of the bad and ruthless business practices of J.D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil. Another really good example is Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. Now, The Jungle is a fictional account of an immigrant family who comes to the United States, settles in Chicago, and works in the industrial factories of mostly Chicago's meatpacking industry. And literally everything that can go wrong for this family goes wrong. It's a horrible, depressing read. But Sinclair is really trying to call for widespread social and economic reform to address these kinds of problems. That said, Sinclair was a socialist, and he was hoping that this would inspire people toward a kind of socialist reform of America's capitalism. It doesn't work. He says, and I'm going to misquote this, but he says something along the lines of he had aimed for America's heart but hit their stomach by mistake. Because really, most people came away from this with was that our meatpacking practices were disgusting and unregulated, and the effect of the jungle is going to be the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act, which called for truth in advertising for food and medicine prior to sale, which would create the FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration. The second thing that the jungle will result in is the signing of the Meat Inspection Act. And this makes a law to inspect meat products prior to their sale and will, in effect, create the USDA, or U.S. Department of Agriculture, who does that job today. The third good example of a muckraking work to have is How the Other Half Lives by Jacob Riis. This was mostly photojournalism, and here he's taking photographs of immigrants and members of the working class in the impoverished portions of the cities. And that really kind of pulled at people's heartstrings to see like homeless children sleeping on the streets at night, or a whole extended family packed into a tiny little tenement with no ventilation, no windows or anything like that. And again, it's calling for social reform without necessarily proposing what those solutions are. Another reason the city was such a central element in progressive America was because immigration contributed to social stresses in the cities. Again, we are in the era of the new immigrants. The new immigrants are coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, typically countries like Italy, Russia, and so on. They were often recruited by American businesses to come into the United States and work as cheap labor for them. This is going to mean that by 1910, 1 out of every 7 Americans was foreign born. That's pretty remarkable. And most of these new immigrants are finding work in factories as cheap labor, where they're going to face things like long hours, low wages, dangerous conditions, all those things that we've talked about before that are a result of our industrialization. They also typically settled in cities in ethnic enclaves, or parts of the city where immigrants of one group kind of flock to. Things like, Little Italy in New York City, for example, where Italians will all settle around one another so that they can preserve elements of their culture, their language, and that kind of thing. Next, cities were also centers of mass consumption of manufactured goods. We've talked about the emergence of national chains like A&P grocery stores, and national brands like Ivory Soap. And in the cities, this is also going to mean around the turn of the century the mass consumption of leisure. And we see the introduction of things like amusement parks like Coney Island in New York City. We'll also see the proliferation of theaters and so-called Nickelodeons, where you could pay a nickel to get into the theater and simply sit there as it plays through movies and newsreels and cartoons and other things like that. Turn of the century is also kind of the heyday of the American circus and the emergence of professional sports, in particular baseball, in this era. So really what's happening here is that people are looking, of course, for escapes from their everyday industrial drudgery, and businessmen find that they can offer recreation, they can offer leisure in the form of amusement parks or movies or sports, and then charge you a ticket for that. So it's yet another money-making venture in the great capitalist enterprise of the United States. Another thing making cities so central is that women were far more visible in urban areas than they might be in rural areas, because it's more common in cities to see women going to work in sweatshops, more common to see them out shopping or present at entertainment venues like the ones we just talked about. And more women in this era, especially in cities, are wage laborers, often with the same terrible, if not worse, conditions that their male counterparts are facing. Case in point is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911. Here, women are packed into a sweatshop a few floors up in New York City. The doors are locked not only to keep women in during the workday, but also to keep socialists and radicals out so that they're not in there like passing out literature about unionizing or striking or anything like that. And when a fire starts in this sweatshop where they are, sewing shirtwaists, all the cotton and all the fabric goes up in flames very quickly, and they can't get out. They try the fire escape, but it's not built for a lot of people, so it collapses. The local fire department, or rather, no fire department in New York City, has a ladder that's tall enough to reach. So women just start jumping. And they're jumping to their deaths rather than be burned to death, which inevitably some are. And it's this horrible tragedy that makes national news, but it's also going to result in some city reforms in New York, things like rules for fire engine ladders or fire escapes, and even installing things like sprinkler systems and other things like that. Of course, cities are still centers of manufacturing. Mass production, of course, for a lot of people held the promise of abundance and prosperity. But again, the cities and the conditions there made it pretty clear that the benefits of America's economic expansion had not been evenly distributed. And that is, again, especially the case when it comes to cities. Number two, how did the labor and women's movements challenge the 19th century meanings of American freedom? So, for some, especially in the working class, the labor movement or unions embodied the idea of industrial freedom. Industrial freedom meant that it meant allowing workers to have some kind of voice in establishing what their wages are, what their working conditions are, what their hours are. The American Socialist Party, founded in 1901, promoted a socialist platform, literally a completely different economic system, in order to address these kinds of problems. And they boast 150,000 members by 1912. Now, remember that socialism doesn't mean complete government takeover of all industry, but rather government should own and operate some business enterprises in order to more fairly distribute wealth among society. Also remember, in an American context, books like The Cooperative Commonwealth by Lawrence Gronlund and Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy were crucial in propagating socialist ideas and promoting the American Socialist Party in the United States. Now, in this era, we're going to meet Eugene Debs. Eugene V. Debs actually comes into at least our attention during the Pullman strike. He had been one of the leaders of the Pullman strike in 1894. He will then adopt socialism and become a leader in the American Socialist Party. And he promoted socialism as the key to not only political equality, but also economic freedom. He's going to run for president several times, and he's even going to garner nearly 1 million votes in 1912, which is about 6% of the popular vote. It doesn't sound like much, but that is the best showing for any third-party candidate to date, or at least to that date. And again, really quickly, a lot of more well-known Americans at the time actually were socialists. So, for example, Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle, was himself a socialist. As we said, he was promoting this system through his work, The Jungle, as well as through a lot of other works. And later on in the 30s, he's actually going to run for governor of California as a socialist and almost win. All right. Next, we have another labor union, the American Federation of Labor. We've met them before. It's led by Samuel Gompers, and this is an alliance of skilled workers in craft fields. So they're more exclusive. They don't accept everyone into the union, namely women, African Americans, immigrants, or even unskilled workers. They're also less radical in their agenda, typically focusing on bread and butter issues. These are simple things like higher wages, shorter hours, better working conditions, and those things only for their union members, not for everybody, just for members of their union. They're also less willing to go on strike. They're more willing to work with management through negotiation practices, which they refer to as collective bargaining. A union that is on the more extreme end of the scale than, say, the AFL is the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW, or for some reason, the Wobblies. Anyway, the Industrial Workers of the World are led by William Big Bill Haywood, and they are striving to create a union that unites all workers, skilled, unskilled, African American, white, women, men, native born, immigrant. So in that respect, they're kind of similar to the inclusivity of the Knights of Labor from back in the 1870s. And the difference, though, is that they embrace the rhetoric, or they embrace the language of class conflict. So it's the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, or the poor versus the rich. They're calling for revolution, and some of them even endorse the use of violent tactics to achieve their goals. The IWW never gets all that large, a couple 100,000, but their rhetoric and their appearance are certainly perceived to be very threatening to the capitalist powers that be, and they're going to be a target for government crackdown later on, as we'll see. Moving to the women's movement. Feminists, or people that believe in equality for women, attack traditional rules of sexual behavior and gender roles during the progressive era. Many are demanding free sexual expression and reproductive choice as a kind of personal freedom. Great example of this is Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger was an outspoken proponent of birth control or contraceptive devices. The birth control pill won't exist, or rather, it's not going to go on the market until 1960. So we're talking contraceptives like condoms, diaphragms, that kind of thing. She was promoting these things as a means of sexual liberation, so women could control their own bodies, determine when they became mothers and gave up, other choices that they might have in life. And she also saw it as a means of poverty relief. She's often marketing these ideas to poor immigrants who, every additional child born is another mouth to feed to a family that is already struggling. Margaret Sanger's promotion of birth control is seen as incredibly taboo, and the government at one point is going to go after her for dissemination of obscene materials through the federal mail. Also note that women were at the forefront of many, if not most, progressive reform movements, very much like they had been in the antebellum era of reform. So it's not just women's issues like birth control or the women's suffrage, but a lot of different things. And this is part of that social housekeeping idea, which grows out of the old idea of Republican motherhood and the cult of domesticity. And it says that if women are assumed to be inherently more moral than men, and they can moralize their families at home, then it stands to reason that they could also moralize the rest of society through engaging in reform-oriented activities. So this did not seem terribly outside of established gender roles for the time. It actually kind of fit with American tradition in a certain sense. 3, in what ways did progressivism include both democratic and anti-democratic impulses? In some respects, as we'll see here, the progressive movement is kind of contradictory. They're both trying to open up the political process and make America more democratic, but in other ways, they are very undemocratic in the groups that they might target or try to exclude, and oppressed groups that they might entirely ignore. So first, what are some democratic impulses of the progressive movement? In general, progressives wanted an activist government that worked towards social change. This is a big deal because the progressives are rejecting the traditional American notion that a big, powerful government was a threat to liberty. Instead, they challenged that, saying that a big, powerful activist government is best suited to ensure liberty, to ensure that people are free and are given a fair shake in this new industrial capitalist economy. So it's a pretty big shift in perception for these Americans. Um, State and local battlegrounds tended, or rather, state and local governments tended to be the chief battlegrounds for these reform movements and the most successful, really. So progressivism is really kind of grassroots movement. It's mostly at the city and state level. In years to come, it'll reach further up to the national level. It's not going to be quite as effective on the national level, but it is something that goes from the bottom up. So in cities and states, progressives are trying to do things like reduce the power of political party machines in cities, things like, Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall in New York City. They're also trying to do things like create public monopolies of gas, water, public transportation in order to distribute those services at a cheaper, more equitable rate for people. They're also going to try to fund more public schools, fund more parks, fund more public facilities. And importantly, progressives are going to try to give voters more direct control over politics. And this is the essence of democracy, where it's ruled by the people. They're trying to put more power, more decision-making ability into the hands of the American people, of average citizens, mostly. So some examples. They are going to push for and achieve an amendment to the Constitution that will allow for the popular election of senators. This is the 17th Amendment. To put this in perspective, the Constitution in its original form said that the House of Representatives will be elected by popular vote, but members of the Senate won't be voted on. Instead, they'll just be selected by state legislatures. So the average voter gets to choose their representative for the House, but they don't get to choose their senator. Progressives are seeking to change that. So now, after the 17th Amendment, voters will select both members of the House of Representatives as well as the senators that will represent their states. Furthermore, progressives are successful in some states, mostly out west, in getting things like initiative, referendum, and recall. These three things kind of go together. But initiative is allowing voters to propose legislation. So let's say the state legislature is ignoring a pressing issue or an issue that has a lot of public support. What the initiative allows voters to do is to go around, gather a certain number of signatures, and that will force the state legislature to consider a piece of legislation, even if they don't want to. So initiative allows the voters to kind of force the issue in front of the state legislature. Similarly, you have referendum. Here, the state legislature, they can send the decision on whether or not to pass a law down to the voters by putting it on the ballot. So rather than your representatives debating and discussing and voting on whether to pass a law, what they'll do is say, you know what, we're not going to make the decision here. Instead, we'll let the voters decide. And on the next election, we're going to put this on the ballot and people can say yes or no to this proposed piece of legislation. So initiative and referendum are kind of similar. A way I think that helps kind of differentiate the two is in their names. So initiative, where voters propose the legislation, think of the voters taking the initiative to go out, gather signatures, and force this in front of the legislature. Whereas on the other hand, the referendum allows for the legislature to refer a piece of legislation to the voters instead. So hopefully that helps. The last one, recall, is pretty easy to remember. This just allows for a popular vote to remove public officials. So if a governor in a state that has recall, if a governor is doing a really bad job, really unpopular, the voters can literally hold a vote to remove them from office rather than waiting for the next election or impeachment proceedings or anything like that. They can just boot them out on their own. And this is very much popular control of politics, which is exactly what these progressive reformers were aiming for. Another democratic impulse is the settlement house movement. Settlement house movement provides shelter and education to the urban poor, oftentimes immigrants. And the idea here is that if you give people a kind of social safety net, if you kind of set a bar below which you don't allow citizens to fall, then you're giving them the tools they need to be successful. You're giving them the tools they need to be equal in this society. So in an era where the state or federal government isn't providing these things to the degree certainly that they do today, settlement houses can do that. So the first settlement house was Hull House in Chicago in 1889, and that's founded by Jane Addams. And also worth noting, the settlement house movement, especially Hull House, is a great illustration of the leadership of middle-class women in progressive reforms, since they are, of course, at the forefront of this. Another democratic impulse is opening up the vote to women. So the women's suffrage movement grew during this era and met with success during this era as well. So you might recall that there was a debate over the 15th Amendment among women suffragists. Some wanted to support the 15th Amendment and give Black men the right to vote as a kind of stepping stone toward women's suffrage, while others said, no, unless women are included in this, we will oppose it. And that split the women's suffrage movement for a few decades. But by the progressive era, they have reunited in what's called NAWSA, NAWSA, National American Women Suffrage Association. And they're going to have a lot of success at the state level, especially in Western states. So the first states that will allow women to vote are places like Wyoming and Colorado, Utah, Idaho. And important to note, the US Constitution says that if you are allowed to vote in your state, then you automatically get to vote in national elections. So that means women in Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho are able to vote not only for state politicians, but also for members of the House of Representatives and the Senate, and even, indirectly, the president. So this was kind of a state-by-state strategy that Nassau was pursuing, because it is ultimately up to each individual state what voter qualifications are. They determine who gets to vote and who can't, with a few exceptions that are in the Constitution. So a state at this time could say, yeah, women can vote, and then that becomes a new set of voters, not just for that state, but for national elections as well. This is a very slow process, but it is the process that the mainstream National American Women's Suffrage Association is pursuing. This will change later on. We'll look at that next chapter with the emergence of the National Women's Party and Alice Paul. Now, anti-democratic impulses. So first, progressives were, to say the least, disinterested with promoting civil rights for African Americans. And at worst, some progressive reformers were actually ardent promoters of segregation, because that would serve to exclude certain voters and people to participate in politics that they didn't think were suited to do that and make those kinds of decisions. Next, progressives generally favored rule by an educated elite or educated experts rather than ordinary citizens. So they wanted to appoint things like city managers and other things rather than have average people be elected to political positions. Finally, and this is the most obvious anti-democratic impulse, is one I mentioned earlier, is that progressive reformers often favored social control in the form of laws, often targeting groups like immigrants and even African Americans. And again, we go back to this comparison between temperance and prohibition. In the antebellum period, reformers had promoted temperance, or trying to get people to choose to drink less, whereas progressive reformers that are aiming for the same goal, get people to drink less, pursue prohibition, which are legal structures to try to achieve the same goal rather than letting people have a decision in this matter. And this was a useful way for them to target immigrants and to try to assimilate them into a more mainstream white Protestant kind of Americanism that most progressive reformers belong to. 4, how do the progressive presidents foster the rise of the nation state? So the progressive movement is really a whole bunch of different reforms that are starting at the grassroots level and working their way up. And eventually they will work their way up to the national level and will be promoted by 3 successive presidents or 3 presidents in a row that we refer to as the progressive presidents. They are first Teddy Roosevelt, second William Howard Taft, and third Woodrow Wilson. Uh, Progressives helped to create a stronger national government, oftentimes as it related to the economy, regulation of business. They thought it was the best way to enact reform and create the social conditions of freedom. So first, Teddy Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt became president in 1901 when William McKinley was assassinated, and Roosevelt had been vice president, thus he ascends to the presidency. Teddy was a unique figure in American politics. He had a big personality, and he acted very aggressively to promote his progressive agenda, which is called the Square Deal. He oftentimes made use of the so-called bully pulpit. The bully pulpit is the idea of using your position as president and all the media attention that that garners to push to get something done. So the president on his own can't actually do an awful lot, certainly when it comes to passing laws. What he can do, though, is get a lot of media attention at this time, in the papers, and he's talking directly to voters, telling them, contact your congressman, contact your House member or your Senate, write them a letter, tell them that this is what needs to be done. So the president can use his singular position to mobilize public pressure against Congress to try to get these progressive reforms done. Now, unilaterally or on his own, Roosevelt was able to use the power of the executive branch to try to break up monopolies. And in fact, he will very effectively use the otherwise ineffective Sherman Antitrust Act to go after monopolies. Uh, he's going after what he calls bad trust. So there are good trusts that he'll allow to remain together, not be broken up, and bad trust, which he's going to target. Now, who determines what's a good trust or a bad trust? Well, Teddy Roosevelt. Um, Nonetheless, he's actively using the Sherman Antitrust Act the way that it was intended to be used in the first place to go after big businesses that were choking out competition and driving up costs for consumers. Teddy Roosevelt also repositions the federal government in regards to strikes and labor conflict. We know that during big strikes in the past, like the Great Uprising, Pullman strike, Homestead strike, when the government steps in, they step in on the side of big business and oftentimes violently crush the strikers or the union members. Not so in this next big one, which is the Anthracite coal strike of 1902. During the Anthracite coal strike of 1902, Teddy Roosevelt will step into this conflict to settle it, but he steps in as a neutral arbitrator. He steps in as someone who's not going to pick sides, but is going to help both sides come to an agreement to end the strike and put this industry back on track to producing for the American people again. And this is the kind of attitude that later executives or later presidents are going to take. So this is a pretty radical shift for the government to no longer be, always on the side of big business, but rather come in as a neutral party to try to help both sides come to the best agreement that they can. Next, Roosevelt made conservationism an important federal policy. He was an outdoorsman himself, and he believed in conservationism, which meant preserving parts of the environment from economic exploitation. Doesn't mean that you can't use, lands for anything at all, but it's more sustainable use, making sure that everything doesn't just get plowed over and dug up and mined out, but rather setting aside places. So Roosevelt will begin a tradition of setting aside wildlife preserves and national parks like Yellowstone or Yosemite so that they can be sustainably used and also still there for future generations to enjoy. There was real fear among conservationists, another group called preservationists, we'll get to them in a minute, there was real concern that the rapid expansion of big business is going to quickly eat up all of these beautiful natural resources out west unless we did something to protect them. Again, Roosevelt was a conservationist, and this is different from a more radical position called preservationist or preservationism. Its chief proponent was John Muir and the Sierra Club, but they were completely hands-off. They believed that resources and land should be completely set aside and untouchable by business or government or private citizens altogether. Whereas conservationists thought that resources could be used responsibly while still being there for future generations. Ultimately, it's the conservationist mindset that's going to win out in this early kind of environmentalist debate, largely thanks to Roosevelt's activism as president. Second progressive president is William Howard Taft. Taft had been Roosevelt's vice president, and when Roosevelt served his 2 terms and steps down, Taft is elected president. So, by the way, both of these men are Republicans, and it's odd to think of, at least in our modern context, it's odd to think about Republicans being progressive, but that's absolutely where the heart of the movement was at the time. But Taft, while he's seen generally as a disappointment for many progressives, there is an argument to be made that he's actually a bit more progressive than Roosevelt. He's actually a more aggressive trust buster than Roosevelt. So, for example, he also uses the Sherman Antitrust Act to go after monopolies, notably going after the biggest one there is. And he uses the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. It's pretty remarkable for the time. Taft also supported the passage of the 16th Amendment, which will create a graduated income tax, which is exactly what the old populists had wanted. Remember, a graduated income tax, or a progressive income tax, as we call it today, taxes people at a higher rate based on the higher income that they have. So people with a better ability to pay, they're going to pay a larger percentage of their income for the public services that we all or most of us use. That said, anyway, despite his more progressive stances and activism on some things, he simply he just wasn't Teddy Roosevelt. So he's very disappointing to a lot of progressive members. So he's going to end up facing a challenge for the Republican nomination in the upcoming election in 1912 by none other than Roosevelt himself. And that's going to make the 1912 presidential election pretty interesting, and it's going to make the outcome something that was sort of really kind of unexpected given the historical context of the time. So both Taft and Roosevelt try to secure the Republican nomination for president. Taft will get it, but Roosevelt barely loses it, and he's going to instead form his own political party, or the Progressive or Progressive Republican Party, which is usually just called the Bull Moose Party, because Roosevelt said he was as strong as a bull moose at one point. He got shot during a speech and just got up and continued giving his speech for like 2 more hours because he's strong as a bull moose. Very interesting character. Anyway, so you've got 2 basically Republicans running. You've got Taft, and you've got Taft is representing the more traditional wing, establishment wing of the Republican Party, whereas Roosevelt is representing the more progressive wing of the Republican Party. And that really kind of breaks the party in half in large part. Roosevelt, with his Bull Moose Party, is promoting a very aggressively progressive platform that he calls his new nationalism. And just to give you some perspective on how radical this would have been, the new nationalism called for things like women's suffrage, a national 8-hour workday, a minimum wage, and other forms of social insurance that we're very much used to today, like unemployment insurance and that kind of thing. So very, very ahead of its time. Perhaps, but definitely incredibly progressive compared to Taft, as well as compared to his Democratic opponent, who is Woodrow Wilson. Wilson will get in on the progressive game too. He's going to call his platform the New Freedom. And the New Freedom is kind of tacitly progressive. It promises to create better conditions for economic competition, which is a basic progressive goal, but without increasing government regulation of the economy. Now, how you do that is, that's your guess as good as mine, but that is his proposal. he'll end up being far more progressive than that'll indicate. And then finally, our fourth candidate is Eugene V. Debs of the Socialist Party, who will merit nearly 1 million votes in the 1912 election, pulling about 6% of the national vote, which is, again, pretty good for a third-party candidate. What ends up happening is that Wilson wins because the Republican Party gets split between its two candidates, Taft and Roosevelt. So if you look at this time period, if you go from like Lincoln in the 1860s to Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s, it's just a whole bunch of Republican presidents and then Wilson right in the middle. This is an era of Republican control in politics. A Democrat has no business winning the presidency in this period, but he does because the more powerful of the two parties splits its vote between two candidates in the form of Taft and Roosevelt. The 1912 presidential election gives us a Democratic president, Woodrow Wilson, and he ended up being a heck of a lot more progressive than his New Freedom platform otherwise indicated. He will sign into law in 1914 the Clayton Antitrust Act, which strengthens the Sherman Antitrust Act. So if we generally consider the Sherman Antitrust Act to be effective, the Clayton Antitrust Act certainly is not. Some other progressive laws that Wilson signs in include the Keating-Owen Act of 1916, which will outlaw child labor, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which will give the federal government more control over banks and currency, and then finally, in 1914, the creation of the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC, which is going to be a federal agency that administers all antitrust or anti-monopoly laws.